And there's this scene where they're recognizing they're from two different spheres of life, and his culture is different from his culture. And so they ask the question, and then I leave it there. I don't make comment past that. They go to study the playbook out of that. So that's a how do you write a culturally relevant story that deals with all the different diversities we have, but you're not trying to make a position. All I do is raise the question, and I leave it for the audience, for the reader to discern. So
Nothing in this podcast is intended to render legal, financial, medical, or other professional information. Because the details of your situation are fact-dependent, we highly encourage you to find a recommended individual that you can trust to give you the expertise that you need related to your situation. Well, good morning or good evening, DocPreneur Nation. You're listening to Concierge Medicine Today's DocPreneur Leadership Podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Gary Parker, PhD. He is a novelist, a screenplay writer. He's been there, done that. He's even sold one or two. We're going to talk about being a publisher, being a traditional novelist in every sense of the word. But also, we're going to dive deep into a new book that he has that I think all of our physicians listening would love to have on their nightstand, because it's a story called The Playbook. And we'll put the links in the show notes below and how to look at it on Amazon and purchase it and all that. But it's a story. It's about character-driven leadership, and it's about being a strong leader in our communities, and also how to persevere in spite of adversity. As physicians, you're persevering and learning every single day. You're probably leading your team, leading your patients in your community, and there's something that you're bumping into every single hour of every day. We want to talk about and unpack how the playbook and being a novelist is, and what you can learn from Dr. Parker today about maybe even writing your own book. So, Dr. Parker, thank you for being with us today.
yeah, Michael, thanks for the time. I appreciate it and look forward to the conversation. I think it's great that you do this, and I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I'm glad, because this is a bit of a different conversation, but I think that there's so much that physicians are going to take from this, because it is such a uniquely different and maybe even a uniquely better conversation than we normally have. So first of all, I want to talk to you about just being a writer. Many physicians that we've interviewed right here on the podcast have written books on their own, whether it's self-published works or they've gone the publisher route. We've interviewed both, but talk about your, kind of tendency, or you're following your dream of kind of being a writer. Is it something you would recommend to people, or is it something you're like, well, it doesn't always pay the bills if I was to look at it that way?
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about what it's like to be a writer and how you kind of got drawn into that.
Yeah, well, I'll give the quick thumbnail sketch of how I got drawn into it, and it began early. I remember a sixth grade teacher who had a short story writing contest in the sixth grade. I began as a reader. I read all the time as a kid. I played sports and read books, and that's kind of what I did. And I happened to win that short story contest, and so that told me from an early age that I might be able to write some. And then in the 11th grade, this same teacher's mother was my English teacher. And one day she called me aside after an essay that I'd written, and she said, "You know, Gary, you write well. You should, quote, do something with that." And so I was a newspaper reporter during college. I graduated from Furman University in South Carolina and worked with the Greenville News for 2 years while I was there. And then at Baylor, wrote a dissertation, which was 240 some odd pages and probably longer than my professors wanted. But I wrote it, and so I knew I could write something long form. And so that's kind of the quick history of it. And I want to go to your point about um, writing. To me, storytelling. I have a statement: words are forever, and I have a lecture that I do called "Writing as a Legacy." So for your doctors, physicians, um, nurses, anyone in any really area of life, I would say when you write something down, it may not be for a public consumption audience. You may never sell 5,000 copies. In fact, 90% of all books sell less than 10,000 copies, and mint and high percentage of those sell less than 1,000 copies. But I would say writing would be for you, for your family, for your legacy, your grandchildren someday pick up a book and say, oh, my granddad wrote this or my grandmother. So I think that's important. And then, of course, your knowledge, you think of the knowledge base that you address in your audience on a constant basis. Um, and the knowledge base that is there, whether that's related to medicine, though I expect a vast majority of it would be, but my suspicion is also that your audience, your people have a variety of other interests outside of medicine, hobbies, arts, um, things that just fascinate them. And so I would say writing for that audience of a learning community as well as a legacy community could be very valuable. So that's kind of the way I look at writing. To me, storytelling is an art form that also teaches, informs, inspires. And so regardless of, the ability to write, putting words on paper and in a file these days, it lasts forever. And you might sell 1,000,000 of them, you might not sell but 10, and you have it also for your family going forward from there.
Well, as an author myself, I've written probably, 20 something books, right? And then maybe
Yeah,
2 or 3 of them are the real popular ones, right? So it's I
right.
mean, it's you have to go in as a writer and as an author with expectations of well, you're going to give away your book probably more than you're going to sell it, especially
Right.
if it's really hyper specific about like smoking cessation or how to grow a practice when in a urban environment. Those are very
Right.
specific audience type of books. Now, you went with more of a as a novelist and as someone who's got a broader perspective on publishers. There's a constellation of small publishers, big publishers.
Right.
What was that process like? And by the way, getting back, I want to pause that for a moment, but I don't suppose your 6th grade teacher was the same as my 8th grade teacher who told me the same thing.
Well, there you go.
Mine was Mrs. Nielsen
Yeah.
I remember she knelt down, eye contact in our
Good for you.
classroom and said,
Yeah.
"You've got a real gift. Keep on writing in 8th grade."
Right.
And I
Yeah.
remember we were in
Yeah.
like Layton or Ogden, Utah. So, but
Wow. And that's a good reminder to people in the educational business just how something like that can be so meaningful and so helpful to a cause somewhere along the way. So just I pin that as a great note to educators.
yeah, for sure. Well, tell us about what was the first, or maybe just fast forward to the more recent. What's the publishing industry like? What's it like to be a writer today?
Yeah, and that's a great question because the industry has shifted so much from really in the last 10 to 12 years. And self-publishing, as you know, with Amazon, the last I saw, there were 34 million books on Amazon, 44 million worldwide. And that's not counting Barnes and Noble and Goodreads. And those would be some repetitions. But I believe the last I saw, over 50% of that is self-published and maybe even higher. And so the world has changed dramatically with the capacity that someone has now to write, to copyright, to get a cover, to put it on as a self-published author. There's some great pieces of literature that are self-published, and of course, there are a lot of great works that are nonfiction that have to do with a particular industry or a particular profession. I chose early on, years ago when I first started, and I won't say how many years because I'm old enough without parenting that. But years ago when I started, the self-publishing just barely existed. There were some who did it, but not a lot. And so I published with traditional publishers at the time. And then, as you said, I went for 8 or 9 years without writing a novel. And in that time, I wrote some screenplays, as you mentioned. Had one sold to auction, not on screen yet, still working on it. And then I said of one of these stories, the Playbook, that I thought it was such a great story, I wanted it to have a life, even if it never made a screen. And of course, writing a novel is a great way, or writing a book is a great way to give your words life. And so when I did that, I sort of had to start over in terms of, do I want to self-publish or do I want to go traditional publisher again? I had an agent 10 years ago, and unfortunately, my agent died of cancer. Great human being, great editor, great agent. And then, and I don't know, part of that may have been why I didn't write for a number of years. I had to go through the process of finding an agent again, or find a publisher that didn't necessarily require an agent. Because many times, as you probably well know, to get in front of one of the big five publishers, you almost always have to be agented. They won't look at someone who comes in with a non-agented manuscript. So when I decided I wanted to publish this novel, um, I spent maybe 3 months kind of looking at the big five and what they were publishing, and some agents, and seeing what they were doing. And then I said, let me see if I can find a small indie publisher, traditional publisher that pays advances and all that kind of thing and does the work in terms of publishing it for you, but also who had a great reputation. And that's what I did. I went and found a publisher that does about 8 titles a year, 6 to 8. Publisher said to me, he said, "Gary, I only publish what I like."
Mm.
And so that meant a lot to me. And he said, "I'm very hands-on. I only do 6 to 8 titles a year. But when I do them right." And his company, his publishing company's been voted a top 10 indie publisher for right at 30 years, over 20 years, somewhere between 20 and 30 years, so a long time. And so that's where I went, still traditionally published, paid in advance. He took care of all the publishing. Um, Marketing has changed significantly since I had last published a novel as well. And so I'm involved more in the social media and doing some of the publicity. Even though he did hire a publicist, he set up a podcast radio schedule for me, and I did a number of those right as the book came out. And so I guess I would say to a writer who wants to write a book, first determine, is it nonfiction or fiction? Because based on what you're doing, it's somewhat easier if your nonfiction is well done, or it's a unique perspective of something that nobody else has already looked at. Sometimes it's easier to find an agent for nonfiction than it is for fiction. Fiction is so highly subjective. It's like art. You walk into an art gallery and you look at it and say, "I don't get it." Person standing beside you says, "Oh, that is so deep." And
Yeah.
so, and so it's the same thing with writing. You writing fiction, that can be highly subjective. And one person reads it and says, "Oh, this is fantastic." Another person reads it and says, "I don't get it." Nonfiction
Yeah.
is a little bit more simplified than that. So you might can find a top 5 that might read it, or to find an agent who could then take it to a. So I'll stop there. Kind of that gives you a quick thumbnail of sort of the way I thought about it and the way I approached it as I did the Playbook.
Well, how did you go about? Did you just Google indie publishers? I mean, how many phone calls did you make, or emails did you, or did you send the whole manuscript? Because that seems like a mistake. Did you just send a portion, like chapter one? Because you don't
Yeah.
want people to steal. I remember being in a movie screen writing class in college, and, I remember the professor, we're still friends to this day, Dr. Melton, and he said, "I'm about to ruin movies for you forever." And and he's like, "If you want to leave, now's the time to go to the registrar's office and get out, because
Mm.
you will see the formula and how movies are so
Right.
formulaic." And now as we
Right.
get older, we see it, and you see the character development. And I thought it was interesting that for those who are considering writing a book, you know, it is tough to write a book. It takes a long time. And I love what John Acuff said. He's the writer of a book called Soundtracks. He's written other books, but he said, you can't practice mediocrity 40 hours a week and
Right.
think that you'll write a best-selling novel on the weekend. So, and Van Halen says, hey, if I was to say, when's the right time to write a book? If you're listening, well, let's follow Van Halen's advice and go right now. So how did you go about finding a publisher? What was that process like?
Yeah, I hear 2 or 3 questions in that, and let me hit the last one first, and that's finding the time and doing the writing. Um, I I I did some teaching in a university one summer on the art and craft of writing a novel, and one of the lecturers said, "Nobody who has a full-time job has time to write a 450." But I said, "Everybody, even with a full-time job, has time to write 10 pages a week for 45 weeks, and that makes up 450." It doesn't have to be 10 pages a week. It might be 6 this week and 12 next week. But the point is still the same, that if you create a discipline in your life that I'm going to write, maybe it's 5 pages, but you determine what you will write. And then you sit down and you start writing. I had somebody tell me once, the only way to write a book is put your butt in a chair and write a book. You know, it isn't going to write itself. So discipline is the key. You don't have to watch as much television. You don't have to spend as much time on your phone. Um, but the discipline is, I'm going to write a certain number of pages, certain number of days a week. Maybe for you, it's 3 days a week. I write 8 pages, or 10 days, or 5 days a week. I write 6 pages, but whatever it is, you determine your discipline, and then you keep that discipline. Because if you just do it sporadically, all right, when I'm inspired, yeah, good luck. You're probably never going to get much written. So I would say that in terms of the discipline, is find your time, stay disciplined with it, write a certain number of pages on a systematic basis, and in a year or 18 months, you'll have a novel or a nonfiction book, whatever. Now, how did I go about finding this publisher? Um, there's a website called Query Tracker, which I think is very helpful. It only costs $25 a year to get the premium model. And I use Query Tracker to find, it's good for looking for agents, and it's good for looking for publishers who are open to non-agented manuscripts, unsolicited manuscripts. And so I would suggest Query Tracker. I use that, and that's the simplest thing of all, because they send out updates, notifications, new editors that are saying they're looking for material, new screenwriters, new agents. It still work. I mean, the return rate on let's say you send it to 10 agents, and you're fortunate to get one agent that'll respond and say no. The other 9 don't even respond. So it's not I'll go to Query Tracker and find my person. You can go to Query Tracker and find the information you need to get the material to that person.
Do they tell you what you should be sending, so you're not sending the entire?
Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of times they will send you to the website of that person, and on that website you'll find manuscript submission, what the requirements are. And a lot of times it's not. I don't think I can remember it saying send the whole manuscript. Typically, as you surely know, it's a query letter, which will be, give me 4 paragraphs about what this is about. Then give me 2 sample chapters. Query letter will be a short note about who you are and what you've done, a lead paragraph about what the book is about, maybe a short synopsis of 200 words or 400 words. They'll outline how much they want. And then they'll say 2 chapters, or the first chapter, or the first 5 pages. They lay out for you what they are looking for. And so then I can tell you, they are looking for reasons to say no. So if they ask for 2 chapters and you give them 3 because you think that 3rd chapter is so good that they won't even open it if you didn't follow the directions. I mean, they get thousands of these manuscripts a year, both fiction and nonfiction. And as I said, they're looking for reasons to say no. Just like a screenplay in LA, and they'll say it point blank. You go on some podcasts or episodes with directors or producers, and they'll say, well, we're looking for reasons to say no. So follow the directions, do your best work, Query Tracker. And then a lot of times Query Tracker would lead to other things. You would see this one, and then you would say, well, And you go to that website looking for that one, and they might have 10 other agents on that website, because every agency, well, I won't say every, but a multitude of them don't just have one agent at that agency. They might have 8 agents at that agency. And typically they'll say, submit to one at a time. But if you get a no from that one, you can submit to a second one. Or they'll say on the website, we all work together to determine what we will accept. So you just submit the one that you think is most open to what you had written. So, but that information will be available on those websites, because Query Tracker will give you the website link, and then you'll take that and go to the website and find these, and they'll show which ones are open to agenting. They'll show the response rate. Like if you find an agent or a publisher and they have a 16% response rate, and another one has 1% response rate, then you'll want to send it to the 16% one first to say, okay, they will respond more often than this one will. So they are that much more open, perhaps, than this one. So you go to that kind of thing. And there are other places too, but that's one I use and think was pretty good.
No, that's super helpful. I'm curious because I think that the physicians listening are probably thinking, I think I got a book inside of me, and 300 pages, for example, is terrifying. 900 pages is terrifying, even though it ends up at 250, right?
Right.
But I tell physicians, because I remember teaching this type of class or at a conference a few years ago, was let yourself off the hook. It's got to be something that you're really interested in and you're really
Right.
passionate about. But hey, 3 pages today, could end up
Yeah.
being 600 or 900 pages by the end of the year, depending upon how you do it, or we'll give you
Right.
2 weeks off for good behavior. But,
Right.
you know, I think I like the idea of, writing in layers, and then kind of like, okay, when I think it was Stephen Pressfield, he kind of wrote, I don't know if you follow his, he's very similar kind of background as you, as a writer, and then he sold some screenplays, and but he was talking about writing in, when you get annoyed and bothered that you have to do something else in your schedule in your day, and you're like, I don't want to leave this alone yet. Like, leave something in
Right.
the well.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't put it all out there and be like, okay, I think I'm going to come back at this next week, because you might not
Yeah.
come back at it next week. It
Yeah.
might be 2 years from now before you come back at it. And
Right.
what really helped me as a writer is, learning that there are islands, idea islands, that I'm
Mhm.
writing about an island today. And then next week I'll come back to it, and I'm going to make I'm going to write a bridge between the 2 islands that I've been
Yeah.
writing about the last couple
Right.
months.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
islands and bridges,
Right. That's a
and
good image.
your editor will help you, walk through that. But when you submitted and you were like, okay, they said yes, I've been to all these publishers, got a bunch of no's. How many no's did you get? And then once you, kind of got approved, like, hey, let's move forward. Uh, what did the end product? We're jumping to the end. Did the start product differ a lot from the end product?
That's a good question. One note, go back to your statement about your islands and your bridges. Hemingway, I believe it was, who said, always stop writing before you're finished.
Right. Leave something in the
Yeah.
well, right?
Yeah, he said, because then you go to bed at night, that's still turning around your head, that develops more, that takes on more legs, and you wake up, and whether it's the next day or the next week, you've got a starting point. If you just wear yourself out with what you're writing today, and then the tank is empty, and then you come back to it the next day or maybe the next week, you go, I have no clue where to go from here. So Hemingway was always stop the pen, that was in his era, before the idea, before the plan is stopped. So, okay. So back to your question in terms of how many I went to in the start of the ending product and the starting product. I started thinking I wanted to get an agent first. Um, I sent, I would say probably 30 agents over about I'd send like 10 a week or every couple of weeks, and then I'd wait on responses. Out of 30 agents I sent to, I think I had 4 or 5 responses. The rest of them didn't even respond. And I'm a published author with at that time, 19 published fiction titles, and one of them was a Doubleday Book Club main selection and a Christie Award top 3. So I have some credential, you know, and yet still some of those agents, they wow. So then I started looking at the background of the agents I had sent it to, and most of them were in New York or LA. And I started thinking, okay, how many of those are going to respond to a football story set in the South? Now, I don't want to generalize any section of the country or any group of people or anything like that. But then I thought, okay, the most of the big agents are going to be in New York or LA. And so I decided, okay, do I really need an agent? I had an agent. In fact, my agent at the beginning was William Morris, which was a huge New York agency. And so I decided, well, let me see if I can do this without an agent. And so I began querying publishers, small independent publishers that I knew would take, or that on their website would take a non-agented material and who had good reputations as a indie publisher. And an indie publisher just means basically it's not one of the top 5. They still publish traditionally, but they're not Simon and Schuster or Putnam, or they've all consolidated so much now. So there are multiple indie publishers out there who do really good work. They're just not headquartered in New York or somewhere like that. So I probably sent it to 10 of those, and I had 3 that said, yeah, we would like to really get serious about this. One of them came back and was very interested in publishing it, but they didn't want to pay in advance and all that sort of stuff. So I'm sort of in my head going, well, without an advance, they don't really have a lot of skin in the game. And I wasn't looking for big money. I don't, unless you're an established writer, there's not, you don't get millions of dollars when you set and get an advance. And, but I sent an email to Bancroft Press, to Bruce Bortz of Bancroft Press, and he got back to me almost immediately. And I'd sent him one chapter, and he said that I want to read the rest of this over the weekend. So I sent him the rest of it over the weekend. And he sent me that. I remember specifically, I got that email on a Friday. My wife, Melody, and I were going to dinner at an Asian restaurant just up the road. And he sent me an email on Friday afternoon. He said, I really like this first chapter. Can you send me the rest of it tonight? I'd like to read it over the weekend. So come Monday, he emailed me back. He said, I read this over the weekend. I think it's really great. You obviously know your way around a novel. And let's talk. So we got on the phone. He told me what he would do. He sent me a sample contract. I looked at that sample contract. I got an attorney that I'd used before, because I always believe, even though I'm an experienced writer, as I said, with 20 traditionally published novels, and and it'd been years since I had published a novel, so I wanted an attorney to kind of look at it and see if anything had changed since all those that I'd had. And I made some minor additions, paid the attorney, went back to him with my edits, and he read it and said, "Hey, I'm fine with this. Let's do it." Oh, and so we signed in January of last year. He told me that he would have it out in 2024, and he did. He did it's in hardback, in Kindle, and it's audio. He's done all 3 versions. He didn't do a paperback. And he said, people who want a tactile experience with a book, hardback provides that. It does create, a price point for some people aren't willing to pay quite as much as they are.
Yeah.
But that's what he did at that point. And, I've been very pleased with the look, and I don't even have a copy here with me. I could show. I probably should have brought a copy from downstairs. Or I don't know if I have a copy on these shelves or not. But I've now signed a contract with him for a second book that'll be out in 2025. And then he recently read a screenplay of mine and said, "Can you put this into novel form?" And I said, "Well, sure I can. That's what I did with the other 2." He said, "Well, I'd like to publish this as well." So I'll have at least one a year over the next 3 years. And
Wow.
but that's kind of how, and the last part, I feel like kind of talk for a little while here. You had another part to a question that was, did it change much from where you were to where you finished? I can go on and answer that, or I can stop and take a breather.
No, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Okay. I just didn't want it going on. Yeah, it could be like your rabbi or your pastor in your church. You don't end up going on forever, I don't suppose. But so did it change much from when I sent it to him to the end product? And my answer would be no. I think part of that is I've done this, now 20 times. I have a pretty basic, pretty decent skill with sentence structure and plot structure and all. He didn't change anything in terms of the overall plot. And also, now this is a point that I think people have to be very careful. I've always used Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word had an editing feature. And all that does is check spelling, it checks punctuation, it checks grammar. If you say ain't no way, it's going to point out the ain't, but you may want it to be ain't because that's the way the character talks. But it'll point it out. And I think that's absolutely legitimate to do that because, all you're doing is the same thing an editor would do is check your spelling and, everybody runs into a spell check. I see it in more and more self-published writers. A lot of those are now just using AI. And to me, that's the